about it at length, and that is the fact that livestock essentially in communal areas traditionally are served as investments or as savings. Virtually every development project in Namibia has sought to see livestock as for commercial purposes, as revenue, and all the debate that goes on about moving the red line, that's going to suddenly turn people from being livestock keepers into livestock farmers. It's just not going to happen. Of course, things can change, but it's really important to, if you think back to the table of commodities and services that people require. Everybody in this country requires some kind of savings, some kind of investment, and traditionally for people in communal areas, in rural areas, livestock are exactly those investments. You can think of chickens or poultry as a sort of a 30-day bank account, goats and sheep as a 6-month bank account, and cattle a 1-year or 2-year investment. Livestock essentially are not for sale. They're used for investments, and for good reason, because people are looking ahead. So those are some of the major circumstances, especially in communal areas and in urban areas, where things are changing, but still rooted in systems that are constrained by the climate, by soils, by market availability, by the need for investments where you don't have necessarily easy access to alternative investments, and or alternative investments which people are not necessarily comfortable with. I'd like now to talk about a few constraints that people face, respectively, on freehold land and on communal land and urban land. Essentially, what we're seeing now with land reform and the concentration of land reform activities since independence has been a move of land from arguably a relatively small number, in fact, a small number of previously advantaged Namibians to a small number of presently advantaged. Previously advantaged to a number of presently advantaged people. And as I showed in that earlier graph, there's something like 2% of all households fit into that category, with being moved of people of land ownership being changed. What we're seeing too is that a lot of farms are increasingly being occupied and used essentially by weekend livestock keepers. So as I was discussing earlier or mentioning earlier, livestock are an investment, they're there as capital and so on. So large numbers of many of those farms essentially are being used as investments, as places to keep cattle, as savings, as capital. So one impact of that on an economic basis is that land is being moved from being productive in some cases into, in terms of producing productive revenue, into a system of use where the land is being used as capital and it's being moved from production into capital. And the implications for that for Namibia economically certainly need to be considered. Some constraints regarding land in urban areas. Firstly, more positively, we really start to there's a lot of talk about poverty reduction and solutions to poverty. Arguably, and there are many papers on this, the solutions to poverty lie in urban areas. So the faster we can essentially encourage people to move away from depauperate, impoverished, tough living conditions in rural areas into town, the sooner we'll see poverty being reduced. There's another good reason to encourage urbanization, and for the reasons that we were debating earlier about education. It's just much easier to provide people with services which are very hard to, health, education, and other public services can be much more easily provided in urban areas. Of greater concern is the fact that slum dwellers or shack dwellers in Namibia can't own land. So they're essentially squatting, and that prevents them from having any secure foundation to build a future for themselves. So the numbers are presently over a quarter of all Namibian families are living in shacks on land in urban areas which they may not own. They cannot own as property. They can't invest in that land. They can't use it as capital. They don't have any security. What is concerning is that by the year 2031, if the rate of movement from rural to urban areas continues, the rate of growth of shacks and slums and so on, there will be more shacks in Namibia than all other housing types put together. So taking the numbers of shacks in this country, people in those debilitating circumstances, there will be more of those shacks than freehold houses in urban areas and rural houses in communal areas combined. So I think you can quite easily see that the social and economic and perhaps even political implications of this rapid growth and these sort of numbers that I'm talking about, where over half the population of Namibia will be in shacks on land that they can't own in just 13 years from now. These are things that are really concerning. Talking a little bit about communal land, if you recall the numbers that I showed you right in the beginning, there's something like 37%, over a third of all Namibian families live in communal areas. Again, they may not own that land. They may not trade that land. They can't use it as an investment. The customary land rights certificate that people can get allows the occupants of that land, not the owners, the occupants of that land, to use a customary land right for housing and to produce domestic crops. It may not be used for any commercial purpose, and it cannot be sold, so it has no investment value. So if you think we have 27% of all Namibian families in urban areas without any secure foundation, you have another 37% of all Namibian families in communal areas without the ability to own land, to invest in land. That adds up to close to 2/3 of all Namibians. And I submit to you that that is a foundation of inequality of significant proportions, that something like 2/3 of all Namibian families can't own property and derive the many benefits that come from being able to own property. Some other lesser concerns, but no, not lesser, but significant concerns. Communal land was set up and is described in the Communal Land Reform Act and in the Constitution essentially as a safety net for the poor, where land would be free for those who don't have economic options elsewhere. But of course, while it's being free for the poor, it's also free from the rich. 5 minutes, okay. Let me hurry up a little bit. So, and as I will show you, there has been that freedom of access to land has been exploited severely. One particular problem is that while people who have customary land rights have some sort of security, have figuratively and literally a fence around their small plot, they have no rights of jurisdiction over the commonage resources that their cattle or they themselves might depend on for water, for firewood and so on. That commonage is completely outside their jurisdiction and is managed by traditional authorities, and the traditional authorities, I think, as you all know, are really not accountable to anybody. They can do as they like with the land, do with the land as they like, and it is that kind of freedom, if you like, or ability to manage land by traditional authorities that have left a lot of people in a very awkward position. I can show you some maps and we can look at figures and so on, but let me just try to persuade you that huge areas of commonage land have either been appropriated or expropriated in Namibia since independence. The occupants, the previous occupants in those areas have received no compensation. We're certainly talking hundreds, maybe between 1,000 and 2,000 families who have been expropriated, as I said, without any compensation. And that has essentially been done at the hands of traditional authorities who have ratified this, often selling off farms to wealthy, influential people. In addition to that, it's interesting to observe that very large numbers of cattle and other livestock in communal areas now belong to non-residents. They belong to people living here in Windhoek or in Gababis or Grootfontein or in Oshakati. So again, in the interest of people putting their money into livestock as an investment, those livestock are placed in communal areas, and as a result, more livestock in communal areas now belong to non-residents, if you like, than to residents. And very large numbers of people are now stuck between a rock and a hard place, having lost their land and as poor as you can imagine. Much of what the doomsday stuff that I'm talking about is essentially helps to, not helps, but maintains and to some degree even promotes poverty in this country. And I submit that if we're serious about reducing poverty, we need to reconsider the whole way in which land is allocated, how it's tenured, and we need to go beyond the focus on freehold land and the relatively few beneficiaries of freehold land, and start to look at people who live in Goriankab, in Havana, and people who live in communal areas across the country. Arguably, there's probably been some slight improvement in equality of land in freehold areas, but in urban areas and in communal areas, it's certainly levels of inequality with regard to land have increased substantially. Much of these circumstances, I would submit, reflect some of the attitudes that we who live in luxury here in Windhoek, and we, as I said, it would have been nice to have this meeting in Goriankab or Okahanja Park. We kind of think we know best for people who live in the north or who live in these areas. The kinds of common assumptions or presumptions that I come across when you talk about security, investments, savings, and so on, you get the people who tell you, well, you know, those people are simple, they live day to day, they don't really plan ahead. This kind of thinking bedevils so much of our attitudes towards people who are not as well off. As I said, we're told, well, they don't need land as an investment, they don't need savings, ignoring the very fact that for hundreds of years, thousands of years, people have used livestock as savings and investments. We're told that if people could own their land and trade with their land, they'll get ripped off, as if they're so stupid that, just everything will be ripped away from them. We're told it's against their tradition. These are simple people again. Traditionally, they don't own their own land. Of course, circumstances change, and they also don't need any kind of collateral value or investment value. This is just something that